Good evening, students and parents. Tonight we're going to move on into Comparing Fractions, Part 1. The unit's been all about showing what you know about fractions and decimals by reasoning their value, and today you're going to show that knowledge by comparing fraction amounts. Remember, you can tell if a fraction is equivalent by using multiplication and division to create equivalent fractions. Today we're going to look at comparing fractions beyond equivalence. Let's start comparing fractions by looking at fractions with a common denominator. Sometimes these fractions will come with a common denominator, as in these examples, or you can make the fractions have a common denominator, as you learned in a previous lesson. In this case, if I wanted to compare 3/8 and 6/8, the whole is cut into the same number of pieces shown by the common denominator. Since the number of pieces are the same, I only need to compare the numerators, telling me that 3/8 size slices is less than 6/8 sized slices. 7/12 compared to 4/12 are all 12th size pieces. And since 7/12 size pieces would be more than 4/12 size pieces, that is the greater fraction. So 7/12 is greater than 4/12. I can also compare fractions using common numerator. When I compare fractions by common numerators, the number of pieces are the same, but the size of those pieces are not. So for common numerators, I'm going to compare the size of the piece. This can be tricky. It's important to remember when using common numerator that bigger denominators are smaller pieces. So 3/8 sized pieces compared to 3/4 sized pieces. 8 sized pieces would be smaller than 4th sized pieces, so 3/8 would be smaller than 3/4. Using this for 5/6 and 5/8, 5/6 sized pieces compared to 5/8 sized pieces, 6ths would be bigger slices than 8ths, so 5/6 sized pieces would be greater than 5/8 sized pieces. If you haven't filled in your note sheet to this point, go ahead and pause the video and make sure to do so now. And we'll continue. You can also compare fractions using compare to 1/2, as you learned with benchmarks. This works when you have one fraction that is bigger than 1/2 and one fraction that is smaller than 1/2. In that case, you can compare to half to find the bigger amount. Looking at my fractions 3/8 and 7/12, I know that half of 8 is 4, so 4/8 would be half, telling me 3/8 is less than half. Half of 12 is 6, so 6/12 would be equal to half, therefore 7/12 is more than half. Since this one is more than half, and this one is less than half, 7/12 is the greater fraction. What if you had an odd number and you wanted to use compare to half? Half of 5 is 2.5, or 2.5. So 3/5 is more than half. Half of 8 is 4, so 2/8 is less than half. Since 3/5 is more than half, it is the greater fraction. Our final strategy for comparing fractions is to compare the leftover pieces. To compare the leftover pieces, I look for only one piece missing from the whole. I compare the amount left over. The smaller leftover piece represents the larger amount. So I'm going to look at 7/8 and 6/7. In 7/8, there's only 1/8 left over. In 6/7, there's only 1/7 left over. 1/7 is a larger slice than 1/8. That makes this leftover piece bigger. So, since this leftover piece would be bigger, this is the bigger fraction. Look at that one more time. To compare 4/5 and 3/4 using leftover pieces, I think the leftover is 1/5 of a slice and 1/4 of a slice. Since 1/4 of a slice is a bigger leftover piece than 1/5, 4/5 is actually the bigger fraction because there's less remaining in the whole than in 3/4. Let's see what that might look like. Look at these examples. 5/8 and 7/8. 5/8 and 7/8 both have a common denominator. So I'm going to use the strategy common denominator. And compare the pieces. 5 pieces of 8s are less than 7 pieces of 8s. 2/4 and 2/6 have a common numerator. When I compare fractions using a common numerator, I compare the amount of those slices. 2/4 size pieces would be bigger than 2/6 size pieces. So 2/4 is larger than 2/6. What if I needed to compare 2/12 and 3/4? In this case, I don't have a common denominator or a common numerator. I could use common denominator by making a common denominator. 4 times 3 is 12. So I can make a common denominator for 3/4 with a denominator of 12 by doing 4 times 3 and 3 times 3. This shows that 3/4 is equal to 9/12. 9/12 is much greater than 2/12. So 3/4 is greater than 2/12. To compare 4/12 and 6/7, I could also find common denominators. But finding a common denominator for 12 and 7 is not as easy for finding a common denominator for 12 and 4. What if I tried compare to half? Half of 12 is 6, so 6/12 would be half, making 4/12 less than half. Half of 7, that's 3 1/2 or 3.5. Since 6/7 is definitely more than half, I can say 6/7 is the greater fraction. What about mixed numbers? We compare mixed numbers using the same strategies. Give these a try, then replay to check your work. Did you get the answers the same as me? For this first problem, I used compare to half. The whole number 2 is the same in both, so that gives me no clue. But 8/10 and 4/9, finding a common denominator would take some work. So instead, I know half of 10 is 5, so 8/10 is more than half. Half of 9, well, that's 4 1/2, so 4 is a little bit less than half. That makes 2 8/10 greater than 2 4/9. For 4 3/7 and 4 3/8, I used common denominator. Again, my whole number was the same, leaving me no help. 3 7th size pieces compared to 3 8th size pieces. 7th size pieces would be larger, making 4 3/7 the larger fraction. I also used common numerator for 7 5/7 and 7 5/9. The whole numbers were still the same this time, but 5/7 size slices would be more than 5/9 size slices, since 7ths are bigger than 9ths, making that also the greater fraction. How are you doing? It's time for the check. Go and complete the check for this lesson. Remember to write the questions from the check in your notes and bring them to class. We'll start by reviewing these problems tomorrow. If you need more help, go back and watch the examples again. Look at your notes for strategies and give it a shot. Have a good night.